I am here to say, while I concede this election, I do not concede the fight that fueled this campaign. The fight for freedom, for opportunity, for fairness, and the dignity of all people. A fight for the ideals at the heart of our nation, the ideals that reflect America at our best. That is a fight I will never give up.
Neil, what just happened?
I don't even know. This feels like one of the darkest moments of American history, certainly of my life.
Yeah, me too. And let's just start with where a lot of people's heads are at, which is the comparison to 2016 and what happened with Hillary. Um, on the one hand, I felt it happening as it was happening, and I thought, oh God, it's not happening again. And the sort of PTSD thing took over. And when I woke up this morning, I felt horrible. And then on a certain level, the fact that we've done this before helped me. And I don't know, do you feel that way?
Well, there certainly felt like a muscle memory to the experience of last night. I mean, it really felt incrementally like what we went through in 2016. Everything from the sort of red states that were coming in initially, the early drop of Florida that was, I mean, in this year wasn't as shocking as it was in 2016, but I think that the great the big win that Trump had in Florida this time around felt like it was demonstrative of things that were going to happen. Just the way that the whole evening unfolded, it felt like a repeat of all those sort of moments of 2016, but with a traumatized body and memory to experience them again.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to throw some numbers out for our listeners just to let them know where we are at the time we're recording this. The presidential race, as it turns out, was not really tied. And Donald Trump is on track right now to not just win the Electoral College, which he's done, but the popular vote. And it's really the first time a Republican has won the popular vote in a very, very long time. It's also a stunning repudiation of the Democratic Party, just really across the board. So there's that. And we're going to talk a little bit about the demographics and to just counter a little bit some of the anger out there on Twitter, specifically anger at quote unquote white women. I just want to say Trump outperformed every single demographic from 2020 except educated white women. And he massively overperformed Hispanics. And that's something we're going to be talking about for a long time. But Neil, I want you to look at a sliver of the electorate, which is the LGBT vote, which is one of your specialties because of your book on gay Republicans. What did Trump manage to do with gay Republicans? Did they actually stick by him?
Well, with LGBTQ voters. So right now the exit poll shows Trump only won 13% of the LGBTQ vote. Earlier this morning, it was at 12%. You know, I guess there'll be maybe a few more tweaks with the exit polling in general. It'll be interesting to see where that number lands. Yep. If it stays here at 13%, that will be the lowest performance a Republican presidential candidate has ever had with LGBTQ voters since that demographic has been tracked since 1992. The previous low was 14%, so only a percent higher, which was in 1992 on George H.W. Bush's reelection campaign when he went far to the right to appease a surging evangelical base in 92. And in 2016, Trump tied George H.W. Bush at the lowest performance at 14% that year. 2020 was this year that we don't really know what the actual number was because, polling around the 2020 COVID election was
Right.
so all over the place and erratic. At one point, it was said that he had won 33% of the LGBTQ vote. Then it sort of came down to 28%. HRC, or another LGBT group, said it was closer to 14%. Whatever it was, I think it was clear that he did better in 2020 than he had in 2016. So it is remarkable, given his overperformance with every demographic group essentially there is out there, and particularly with demographic groups that are, high performers for Democrats, that his numbers plummeted with LGBTQ voters this go around, especially when we've been told so much in the last year or two that, the LGBTQ community is, it's dividing itself, that it's sort of, there's these schisms within the community along these trans issues and all that. What we see, and I think what will be clear whenever the final exit poll numbers are tabulated, this is a consistent, across the board repudiation of Trump from LGBTQ voters.
And it's really interesting because, as you write in your book, of course, gay men were really sort of the foundation of the gay rights movement, gay conservative men. And I think we talked about this in an earlier episode, that a lot of the LGBTQ voters who support Trump are pro-business and pro-growth. And, so a lot of their other interests align with Trump, and they may actually not see being lesbian or gay as a crucial identity issue, as, say, liberals might or centrists might. But what do you think really drove them away? Because Trump hasn't really gone after lesbian and gay people. He has gone after trans people. Do you think people are extrapolating from that?
I have to say, I am surprised by these numbers. These were not the numbers I was expecting. I mean, I guess we've just been surprised across the board. I was anticipating a Harris win here, but a strong showing for Trump among LGBTQ voters. Like, I thought it was quite potential that he would actually break the other record of maybe the highest performance ever with this group. Because so much, again, has been said about the LGBTQ community splintering apart, that there's this growing sense among especially gay men and lesbian women that the Democratic Party has become overly woke, even around issues of trans rights, and that there isn't a shared sense of what LGBTQ rights even means. And also at least a Trump candidate himself, who hasn't talked that much about this. But I also think if LGBTQ issues are not the overwhelming thing that drive a lot of LGBTQ voters, there's multiple ways to read that. That can also mean that they still stay within the Democratic fold, and that they repudiate an autocratic, dictatorial madman on those terms alone, LGBTQ issues aside. And I think there's something to be said about that. And thank God for them, at least being one demographic that did not show any ground to this madman.
Yeah. No, that's yay us. Yay for the people. So let me throw another number out there, which is as bad or in some ways worse than the presidential number, although the fact that Trump is occupying the White House is going to be really, really bad, which is the Senate. Republicans flipped 5 seats so far. I think there's still 3 outstanding. And have won control of the Senate. My guy, Dan Osborne, lost by 5 points. He was swamped. And so the problem here is not just firm control of the Senate, which of course means judicial appointments and so on and so forth, but that in 2026, really there aren't a lot of vulnerable Republicans. There isn't any way to easily reverse that. What were your thoughts about the Senate last night and this morning?
I feel like of all the elections we were watching, the Senate surprised me the least.
Right.
I just still am sort of overwhelmed by the presidential results. I do think it's interesting to see these states where Republican senators seem so safely in place, even when maybe the presidential election was a tighter a tighter race in certain places. Although I guess that's not necessarily true in the cases of the states that were
Right.
looking at senatorial elections this year. But I don't know. I mean, I don't really know how to interpret the Senate results, but I do know, as you said, how to really worry about
Yep.
the consequences for American politics. That the Senate is firmly in the hands of Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was beginning to think about, because of course Jim Justice won in West
Yeah,
Virginia, which we all expected him to do. West Virginia is a red state, and actually, Joe Manchin was not really a Democrat. So we expected Justice to win. Larry Hogan was turned
yeah,
down in Maryland, and Angela Alsobrooks was elected. And this will be the first Senate that has two Black women in it who, and actually I think also Brooks is only the second. These are only the second and third Black women to be elected to the Senate,
mm,
um, and so that's kind of historic. But one of the things that sort of bothered me about this is it kind of looks like the Senate is becoming this sinecure for governors. Like there's really no place for governors to go, but they've won statewide elections, so then you run them for Senate. Um, and so that worries me that we are sort of developing this permanent class of
yeah.
senators from the ranks of governors. The other thing I was really thinking about with the Senate is this is one of the places where I expect the Democratic Party to tack right. And I think this is one of the things that the left wing of the party, or people who say they would be Democrats, except they're actually too left wing and too pure to actually be Democrats, I don't think they really understand politics well enough to know that the ways in which they undermine the Democratic Party in this election mean that the Democratic Party must become more conservative or it will become non functional. There's no way Democrats in the Senate can get anything done that they care about without making compromises with the Republican Party.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what sort of scuffles arise between House Democrats and Senate Democrats, although, one would hope, given what they're up against, that they could form
Yeah,
a consolidated opposition to just the huge Trump majority here, and against the White House as well. I think that's I think that I'm really intrigued by your point about the sort of governor to Senate pipeline. Another name that sort of occurs to me that I think is worth bringing in because it reflects on this conversation is Sherrod Brown in Ohio.
right,
And I suppose he was the one surprise for me in the evening, even though obviously Ohio has just become deeply red. But Sherrod Brown is a very popular
right.
senator in Ohio, and I thought he would be able to pull it off based on history and name recognition, and has not. So I think there's also a question about like what is the future of Democratic leadership
Right.
here, and is the Senate the place that we're going to see it, or is it going to have
Right.
to come from some other place? Is the governor's houses? I don't think it's the House. I don't know.
I think it's got to be the governor's houses. And I think, Sherrod Brown, rest in peace, I think that was an effect of the Trump strategy, which
Yeah,
was very effective, which is to bring in people who don't normally vote. And so they brought in all of these white men who don't normally vote. And they're not going to come in and say, oh, but Sherrod Brown was a really good senator. They have
right.
no idea who Sherrod Brown is. So I think that's where the Trump strategy that I thought was idiotic turned out to be very effective. Because, what we're seeing in all of these states is Democrats down by sometimes double digits. I mean, in places like New York, for example, in Queens, in Brooklyn, we're seeing just Republicans performing in numbers they haven't performed in since the 1960s.
Yeah,
So I think that's where we lost Sherrod Brown. And I am sorry about that. He's a good man. I do think there's going to be all kinds of deal making in the Senate. And then, of course, the third piece of bad news is that the Democrats are probably not going to win back the House. That remains to be seen. Of course, there's a bunch of very close races. Right before this taping, I took another look at it, and Republicans currently have a 17-seat majority with 26 races yet to be decided. I think in 9 of those races, Republicans have a slight lead at this point. But I think we can expect all that money that was supposed to go into defending the presidency to be going into these districts to make sure that every vote is counted. Really, if the Republican Party gets a trifecta out of this election, that that's really scary. I think there's no check. They've got the Supreme Court. And I'm not sure what happens next. I'm sure this has happened before in American history, but I don't know what happens next, Neil.
Yeah, I mean, whether or not the sort of political landscape we've seen antecedents to it before, the aberration here is Trump himself. Trump
Right.
as the aberrant actor, and a system that is now completely built around him. There are going to be no checks on him, obviously from an opposition party if it doesn't have any branches of government, but no longer from any sort of never Trump movement within the Republican Party, or even a recognizable Republican Party pre-Trump.
Right.
I mean, there is this part of me that wants him to, like, first day do the across the board tariffs and see, will the Wall Street Republicans, will the Better Business Bureau Republicans, like, finally step up and say, whoa, we didn't think you were actually going to do that, like, stop, and that they will become the rein on him. But, like, I don't even have faith in that anymore. I'm very scared. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm really, really scared. And I think the difference between this and 2016 is 2016 felt like my response was, surprise and shock, surprise and anger, but there still felt like something that could be done with that. This is a devastation that feels heartbreaking and also feels completely immobilizing. Like, how do you resist? How do you stop this? I don't know. And they're now touting Project 2025 today. They've all suddenly remembered it.
Oh, yeah, it exists.
And it's like day one agenda. Turns out,
yeah,
Trump is aware of it. It is the plan. I mean, this is a Katie bar the door moment.
Yeah, it really is. And part of what feels different to me from 2016 is I remember the next day, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer coming on television and saying, everything's going to be okay. We haven't had that moment from the Democratic leadership. I don't know where they are. I don't know what they're doing. And of course, Hillary pretty much came out and conceded right away. I think Vice President Harris is going to be conceding in a couple of minutes from when we're taping this. So we'll both watch it on YouTube. But it's an odd sort of gap for the party to have gone silent on us. And, I'm getting emails from the chair of Mass Democrats and so on and so forth. But I really did have that moment when Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi addressed the nation of thinking, okay, they're going to do something. It's going to be okay. It's going to be really hard. We had no idea how hard it was going to be. And that's what I'm a little scared of right now. I mean, when Trump took over, there was all of this like, he's owed our support and blah, blah, blah. And then boom, the next thing you know, people with valid visas and green cards are being taken off planes in Nigeria. So I fear some of that. I fear what you're saying about Project 2025, which is there will be a much more methodical, more normal seeming type of repression across the country. Here's what I wonder. I mean, what we're seeing in the last few elections is we are seeing independent voters in particular sort of zipping back and forth between parties, right? We're seeing a lot of Obama Democrats who shifted to Trump in 2016. We saw a lot of those same people shift back to Joe Biden in 2020. Now they're gone again and they're back to Trump. And this sort of continual desire for change seems to be happening in a kind of empty policy environment, at least
Yeah.
on the part of the Democrats. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. First of all, just to add to the doomsday list you were sketching out, I want to add mass deportation, which Trump's
Right,
campaign spokesperson said today would be a day one objective. That is terrifying in itself. It's also frustrating, is perhaps the word, in light of the numbers we're seeing around Latino support for Trump.
right.
I mean, we'll just have to watch that, but it's a scary thing that they have signaled is going to be from the start. In terms of the voters and policy, I guess another question I have is this election is also missing, I think, 15 million voters from 4 years ago. I mean, that
Right,
number may have shifted a little bit, but there is a huge disparity in how many people voted in this election versus the last one. What are we to make of that?
right.
How do we account for that? I do think you're right, though, about the independent voters. Obviously, they are often the decision makers. Um, they're not, I think we thought that they were being met on the policy front around the issue of reproductive rights. I mean, that
Right,
is what every single story reported over the last couple of weeks has been about.
right.
Um, and I'm sort of losing my mind by how easily I fell to these narratives of independent women, of Republican women, of independent suburban dads, and on and on and on, all being mobilized by this one issue. That obviously did not play out, and which is a sort of conundrum in itself, but it only works to highlight your point of a lack of a broader policy agenda that resonated with independent voters and brought them over to Harris for
Yeah.
this election.
Yeah, I think that's right. And now that you mention reproductive rights, of course, let's talk about the fact that New York State did enshrine an ERA in its constitution, which also includes protections for pregnant people. And then the other is that Florida voters only hit 57% on their reproductive rights resolution. They needed 60% for it to pass, and they didn't hit it. So, what's going to happen there?
Yeah, only hit 57%. I
Right,
mean,
exactly, which is like
most,
massive.
absolutely, most backers of any policy or any
Right.
candidate would be, especially in this moment, would be
Yeah.
delighted with a 57% win. And of course, this only happened because somewhat recently, Florida voters passed by only a like slight 50% margin this change that said ballot initiatives or whatever the ballot amendments have to now have 60%
Right.
threshold.
Right.
Um,
Which Ohio
so
tried to do and they failed.
right. So Florida, I'm native Floridian here. All my family lives there. I'm certainly aware of the reddening of that state over the last decade or so. I actually thought it had gotten tighter. I mean, this was one of the places that I didn't think Harris was going to win it, but I thought it was going to
Right.
get to be a closer one. For it to be such an overwhelming win for Trump, um,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, I think that's right. And I think one of the things that we perhaps didn't anticipate, but that we're going to have to pay more attention to, is that some voters are very easily able to separate reproductive rights from other issues. So it's like they want their reproductive rights, but they also want to vote for Republicans, and so that reproductive rights may not be the motivator in
Yeah,
future elections that it has been. I also just want to say, and there are a number of groups that this is going to be very bad for. One of the things I thought about last night, because I saw on my iPad that, the in anticipation of Trump winning, the sort of early trading on markets was like driving stock prices up, and Wall Street opened on a high today,
yeah,
and they're all the bros are thrilled. And that reminded me that in many ways, I'm going to be okay. Like where I'm positioned in the world as a retired person with a pension, um, a Trump presidency drives my fiscal interests, which is horrible. on a certain level. But one of the things I was thinking about is transgender people are really in bad shape right now. I mean,
Hmm.
if I were transgender right now, I would be very afraid. It's hard to know what's going to happen next. And honestly, it's hard to know that all of the animus that has been stirred up against transgender people is not ultimately going to be turned against gay and lesbian people, too.
I mean, this is what I've been not necessarily warning, but certainly raising as a
Right,
question to think about
right,
in light of the book I finished and just, the developments of the last couple of years.
right,
There's this, absolute certainty among gay Republicans that none of this is coming towards gay marriage, that is written in stone. And the notion that anything in this country is written in stone is mind boggling if you've paid attention to American
right,
history or recent memory of Dobbs being overturned, or
right,
excuse me, of Roe being overturned via Dobbs. Um, it is an objective of Project 2025
right,
to dismantle same sex marriage.
right,
I think, is it the first priority of this administration? Probably not. I think
right,
immigrants are will be the first in line, and I think there's going to be really, really scary stuff that happens around mass deportation. But I think you
yeah,
are right that there is going to be an acceleration of anti-trans stuff that's probably going to happen really soon. And that if there's a momentum with that, which there probably will be, then it's just so easy to
right,
continue that
right,
into what we would have known more traditionally as gay rights.
right.
The military, same-sex marriage, employment protections. I think everything is vulnerable.
Yeah, I think everything's on the table too. And one of the things that I've been sort of astonished by, and you know, maybe we should devote an episode to the Hispanic vote at another time when you and I have had some more time to dig into it, because it's one of those things that people have talked about for years, and yet neither party seems to know a whole lot about it, and they
Yeah.
seem to be sort of playing around. But one of the things that has been bruited around on a number of podcasts is this whole notion that Hispanic voters think of themselves as Hispanic is wrong. They think of themselves as white, and that actually electorally they behave like white people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that may be one thing that is not working here. But I also noticed with the bans that went into place after Roe was overturned, a ton of conservatives I knew who have supported the overturning of Roe forever and ever and ever. Once it happened and these bans went into place and women started dying in parking lots and started bleeding out for lack of care, my friends would say, well, I had no idea that that's what would happen.
Right.
Right. And so I kind of wonder about all these people who voted for Trump. And you have to believe that there are a lot of Hispanic families who have family on both sides of the border, and, have complicated relationships to the border. You got to think that there's going to be a moment as people are being rounded up and sent to places they've never lived and separated from their families, and children are suddenly without parents, and so on and so forth. You got to think there's going to be a moment in which people are going to say, well, I wanted him to seal the border, but I had no idea that would happen. And
Right.
I'm just like, what is wrong with people, right?
Well, I think what you're describing is a common
Yeah,
psychological way of being in this country, which is to imagine that none of this is going to happen to you.
right,
And abortion is the first example of that, or that you can't imagine all the potential implications of this sort of
right,
abstract idea,
right,
and that it might come quite close to home
right,
once it's put in place. And I think, we're seeing this absolute. I mean, I think we can anticipate this as well with Latino voters, because there is, and a lot of reporting is around this today about all, there's lots of Latino voters being interviewed of like, why did you support Trump, and what are the sort of what's the rationale there? And there's this sort of sense of, first of all, they don't conceive of themselves, as you said, as this like Latino identity. They have a sort of much more a national identity. They also like are proximate to whiteness that I think shapes
right,
a lot of this. But the sense that this isn't about them, it's about
Right.
other people. Even as the Trump administration or the Trump team recently said, not only are undocumented people going to be pulled out of this country, legal citizens are also going to be pulled out, like entire families.
Right.
Like we're just ripping them out whole cloth.
Right.
They've announced it.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump has announced everything he's going to do. I don't want to see how this plays out, but like we are going to see how it plays out.
Right. And, for viewers that, think there's no precedent for this, please look at World War II and
Yeah.
look at what happened to Japanese American people, many of whom had been born in this country and whose belongings were seized, who were impoverished, who were taken to there was the Santa Anita racetrack in California was one place where people were taken, but then they were taken to these hastily built camps in places like Nebraska and Idaho and Washington State and so on and so forth. And it was a terrible, terrible crime, and it was recognized by the Supreme Court in 1944 as a terrible, terrible crime. So I think we can anticipate that a lot of lawyers are going to go to work on this, but I think we can anticipate that a lot of people are going to be hurt. A lot of people are going to be hurt. And so, Neil, we're going to have a lot of work to do this year, trying to sort this out. And viewers, send us your questions in the comments and send us the things that you're interested in, that you want to see on the table, because Neil and I are committed to working hard during the next 4 years to try and parse this for you. So Neil, normally we do something now that we want to go viral. It's very difficult to think what could possibly go viral at this moment. So I suggested instead that each of us pick something that is comforting to us at this point. And I wonder if you were able to come up with anything.
I saw this on Matthew Dodd's Twitter, and it just really spoke to me. It's a piece of poetry. I'm not a poetry reader myself, didn't even know this poet, Ted Kuzer, but it's just beautiful. It's short. I'm going to read it.
Thank you.
It is called Labocraspis grisifusa. Pardon my pronunciation of that, but this is the poem. This is the tiny moth who lives on tears, who drinks like a deer at the gleaming pool at the edge of the sleeper's eye, the touch of its mouth as light as a cloud's reflection. In your dream, a moonlit figure appears at your bedside and touches your face. He asks if he might share the poor bread of your sorrow. You show him the table. The two of you talk long into the night, but by morning the words are forgotten. You awaken serene in a sunny room, rubbing the dust of his wings from your eyes.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Neil. We're going to link to that in the show notes so everybody can have that for themselves. So mine is very different, but it was sort of an odd coincidence that going into the selection, I was rereading a kind of classic text in the field of American history by Morris Isserman called If I Had a Hammer, The Death of the Old Left and the Birth of the New Left. And it was published by Basic Books in 1987. And it comforts me for an odd reason. The Communist Party in the United States was just a hot mess for many reasons. But a lot of people who were communists had great ideals. And they worked in a number of important places. They worked in unions, they worked in publishing houses, they published the Daily Worker and made almost no money from it. And they had a community that was in many ways quite loving and separate from the rest of the political community in the United States. The Communist Party falls apart after World War II for a variety of reasons. There's some factionalism, but in 1956, it becomes clear to everyone in the Communist Party because of a speech Khrushchev gives at the party Congress that year that they've been lied to about everything in the Soviet Union. And it's just shattering. It's absolutely shattering to people whose entire lives, whose entire social lives, they sent their children to communist camps. It's like everything flies apart. And people are trying to figure out how to put it back together again. And what Morris writes about is how this moment of shattering results in something completely new as sort of bits of the Communist Party latch on to the peace movement, latch on to the civil rights movement, latch on to Bayard Rustin and A.J. Must's Fellowship of Reconciliation. And what comes out of that is SDS. And what comes out of that is the anti-war movement. And what comes out of that is actually a left that is going to reshape the direction of the Democratic Party and make it what it became. I think that Democratic Party is over now. I think we will have to have a new Democratic Party. I think we are at a moment of shattering right now. But Morris's book comforted me because it reminded me that in history, things do shatter and they produce new things. And we can't always know what those new things are at the moment of the shattering.
Yeah.
So, Neil, together we'll figure out what that new thing is.
All right. Sounds good.
See you then.